And a new three-part series in which Linda Geddes investigates forensics in crisis and asks whether scientific evidence used in criminal cases is becoming increasingly unreliable.
A series of recent high-profile cases has thrown the field of forensic science into crisis.
Cleared of murdering Jill Dando, Barry George is found not guilty at his retrial at the Old Bailey.
In 2001, Barry George was convicted of killing Jill Dando, largely based on a microscopic speck of gunshot residue found in his pocket. But after spending 7 years in jail, that evidence was overturned.
At last year's appeal, new evidence emerged. There was no proof that the speck of residue had come from the murder weapon or that Barry George had fired it.
Meanwhile, another forensic scandal was brewing in Scotland.
A group of senior Scottish lawyers has joined calls for a public inquiry to restore confidence in Scotland's fingerprint service. Confidence has been severely undermined by the case of Shirley McKee, a former detective who was paid £750,000 in compensation after she was wrongly accused of visiting the scene of a murder.
Shirley McKee was investigating the brutal murder of Marion Ross in 1997 when she was accused of leaving her thumbprint at the crime scene. But McKee denied being there and was charged with perjury until an investigation proved that the print wasn't hers. A subsequent inquiry exposed serious weaknesses in fingerprint evidence.
Amanda Knox says she's tremendously relieved after Italy's highest court acquits her and her former boyfriend of the murder of British student Meredith Kercher.
Then, earlier this year in March, Amanda Knox and Raphael Sollecito were finally cleared of killing Meredith Kercher. At their first trial, the court heard that DNA evidence had been found on a knife, possibly the murder weapon. But chemical tests revealed no signs of blood. We'll be looking at that case in more detail in the last programme of this series. Mistakes like these, together with cuts in UK funding, are prompting leading forensic experts to speak out about an impending emergency.
I've never been so concerned about forensic science as I am at the moment, and that seems to be shared by a lot of my colleagues working in the industry.
Forensic science in the UK currently is reaching a point of crisis. There are a lot of areas and a lot of types of evidence that we currently use that have got fundamental problems.
Unless we're much more careful about interpretation and presentation of our findings, then we can expect to see from forensic science a new batch of miscarriages of justice.
As a science journalist, I've watched as concern around these issues has grown. In this three-part series, I'm going to look at why forensics is in trouble, from fears that the wrong evidence is being submitted to worries that vital specialist techniques are dying out. The cracks were exposed in 2009 with a report by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. It was launched after a string of wrongful convictions based on bad science, and its conclusions were damning.
Testimony based on faulty forensic science analyses may have contributed to the wrongful conviction of innocent people.
It went on to say,
in a number of forensic science disciplines, forensic science professionals have yet to establish either the validity of their approach or the accuracy of their conclusions.
Most scientists were resigned to the fact that we knew that there were problems and we knew that these problems needed to be articulated.
Niamh Nic Dade is a professor of forensic science at the University of Dundee. Like me, she was at the conference in Denver, Colorado, when the National Academy released what's now known as the NAS report.
It was really groundbreaking because what it exposed was what many forensic scientists, not just in the United States but across the world, were really aware of, which was significant scientific deficiencies across many of the different methods that we use both to examine evidence types, but in particular to interpret different types of evidence. And so the NAS report put that into the public arena really for the first time.
So what kind of problems was it highlighting in forensic methods?
In many areas, the NAS was looking at a number of different types of what we would call really quite conventional evidence types that's used almost on a daily basis. So looking at the examination of things like fibres and hair and so on. So there was a general concern around the validity, around the professionalism of how forensic analysis was being carried out.
Obviously, this report was on forensic techniques used in the States. How relevant was the NAS report to the UK?
Well, forensic science and forensic evidence is not a national issue, it's an international issue. And the techniques that we use in the United Kingdom are the same techniques, broadly speaking, as are used in the United States or in Europe or in Australia or elsewhere around the world. So for many of the evidence types, it's completely relevant right the way across the world.
The report highlighted serious problems, from ballistics to bite marks. Inaccurate science was being presented in the courtroom by unreliable experts. As lawyer Peter Neufeld found out when he started digging into past investigations, such as the murder of law student Catherine Schilling.
Back in 1981, in Washington, D.C., a young paralegal who was a full-time student at Georgetown University, working for a law firm for the summer, was on her way home. She had left the Watergate office building, which of course to your listeners has other meaning, and on her way home she was viciously attacked, raped, and shot in the head, evidently by a stranger. The police did an initial investigation. Their vision sort of focused on a man named Donald Gates. He was an African-American male who had just been discharged from the armed forces. Unfortunately for Mr. Gates, as a result of his experiences in the military, he did develop a drinking problem. And so he did have a few arrests for, disorderly conduct, sleeping on a park bench, shoplifting, things like that.
A fortnight earlier, Donald Gates had been sacked for drinking wine in his work break. Walking through the park by the Watergate building, he drunkenly knocked over a woman in broad daylight and allegedly tried to steal her handbag.
And because of that, they began to focus on Donald Gates. And a person came forward and claimed that he had been in a park with Mr. Gates a couple of days earlier, where Mr. Gates was basically bragging to him about how he had attacked and killed a woman near the Watergate office building a few days earlier. And of course, at the crime scene, hairs foreign to the victim were left. So those hairs were sent to the FBI crime laboratory, and reference samples were plucked from Mr. Gates and sent off for comparison. And the FBI agent hair examiner, he wrote a report saying that the hairs found at the crime scene were consistent with having come from Donald Gates. And then when he testified at trial, he testified that the probability that the hairs came from anyone but Donald Gates were 1 in 10,000.
The case against Donald Gates seemed clear. We'll return to discover what happened later. But first, to find out how forensic evidence is collected, I went to visit a crime scene. Not a real one, of course, but the next best thing, a crime scene house at Bournemouth University.
So if you'd like to put the white suit on...
Should I take my boots off?
You can put it over your boots because you'll have overshoes on.
Alex Otto was a crime scene investigator with Wiltshire Police. Now she trains students, and today, that's me.
The reason we wear these suits is it minimises contamination in the crime scene, so you don't want to be taking anything into a crime scene. So if you pull it over the top...
Now zipping it up.
Zip it up, yep, that's right.
And there's a hood. Do I put the hood on, or...?
Firstly, you need to put your hairnet on.
Okay. Presumably you don't want my hair
no.
contaminating the crime scene.
No, we don't want it dropping out and then you collecting your own hair.
There.
Right.
Okay.
Ready
now I
to
look
go.
like a fully fledged CSI.
So what we're going to do today is I've set up a crime scene for you to have a look at. And the scenario is that a male has been shot in a house. Police have been called after neighbours heard shouting. On entering the bedroom, the officers discovered a male deceased with a gunshot wound to the chest. There's a large amount of apparent drugs in the area.
Okay.
So we're going to go in here.
We're entering a small, and somewhat dingy flat. A battered-looking male mannequin is slumped on the floor, covered in fake blood. In the corner of the room, I spot a bowl of white crystals and a stash of £20 notes. Next, we begin looking for vital clues.
As you can actually see on the floor, there's some sort of white powder.
Yeah, and what looks like footprints in the powder.
And they would need to be collected. So what you'd do is you'd use what's known as an electrostatic lifting apparatus, an ESLA. The ESLA works by lifting the actual impression from the carpet onto this mylar foil here.
And you're cutting a strip of this foil off the roll with just a normal pair of scissors. I mean, this machine you've got here, it's a kind of white handheld device. Looks like a kind of very early mobile phone in a way.
Yes, it does. It looks like a very large early mobile phone. So what you would do is you'd position your foil over the footwear impression. Metal plate is placed just slightly away from the foil itself. And you'll see at the bottom there's 3 probes. So you place 2 probes onto the metal plate and 1 probe onto the foil itself. You turn it on and very slowly you just pull the electricity charge through.
And now you're brushing this foil with a roller.
And then you can turn it over and there's your footwear impression.
And on the back of the foil, so what's holding that powder onto the foil? Is that just static electricity?
The static electricity has brought it up. Now obviously this needs to be photographed straight away because it's very fragile, and by doing that you can then identify the shoe. Right, we're going to focus next on the bed. As you can see, there's a clump of hair. Now again, we're just going to use sticky tape.
So you're getting what looks like sticky back plastic out.
Yeah. And you can just place it over the top. And then we've got a piece of acetate. And then you will just place the hair onto the acetate. And then you'd write on the acetate strip itself where you collected the hair from and what your exhibit number would be for that.
These exhibits are bagged up by the crime scene investigator and taken back to the police station to decide which tests should be done. We'll be looking at that process in more detail in the next episode. But analysis of physical evidence like footprints and hair is fraught with difficulties.
If I was going to look at a shoe print or a footwear mark, I can use the thread pattern on the mark that I see to be able to characterise the particular type of shoe. So I can say whether it's a training shoe or whether it's a walking boot or whether it's a court shoe. It can be argued that when you look at data that you get from materials that are left over at crime scenes, that data is partial. So we might see partial shoe prints or footwear marks. And trying to get an exact match is incredibly difficult, and it becomes very subjective. And one of the big things that was emerging out of the NAS report, and is a big issue in forensic science in general, is the difference between subjective examination and objective examination, where objectivity is looking at a set of data that you can use statistical interpretations and also you can use mathematical algorithms to match, whereas subjective is based on your subjective opinion, what you think matches.
And what about taking hair analysis as another example?
Well, hair analysis is an interesting one to take. Not very many laboratories will do hair analysis anymore. The analysis of hairs emerged probably around the 1950s, and it's what we would call a morphological examination. In other words, we're looking at the physical characteristics of the hair, such as, for example, the pigmentation, the scale pattern on the surface, the colour and so on. The problem is that we don't have an awful lot of underpinning knowledge as to what the variability of hair looks like, even within the single individual. So if you plucked out one of your hairs and you looked at it under the microscope and you looked along the length of that hair, you'd see different characteristics depending where you looked along the length of the hair. And if you plucked out 2 or 3 of your hairs, then you would see different characteristics between the hairs. Nowadays, we would do DNA analysis of hair. So hair morphology isn't really used anymore in terms of forensic comparisons. And hair came under particular attack in the NAS report because there was little, if any, scientific basis for how hair comparison was undertaken.
So what about the hair evidence recovered from the crime scene where Catherine Schilling was murdered? The FBI analyst claimed that they matched hairs taken from Donald Gates, a 30-year-old African-American. But at trial, Don Gates pleaded innocent.
From the very beginning, Donald Gates was assertive that he was innocent, had nothing to do with it, wasn't even near that area of town when it happened. On the other hand, you had this informant snitch, and then you had the FBI agent. Why would he lie? Why would he be mistaken? He testified that the probability that the hairs came from anyone but Donald Gates were 1 in 10,000. And of course, that's very compelling evidence, particularly when it comes from a witness wearing a white laboratory coat. And Mr. Gates was convicted, basically sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison.
But as we've heard previously, it's impossible to say with any certainty that a hair found at a crime scene belongs to a particular suspect based on morphology alone.
Remember, with DNA testing, there have been these exhaustive population studies, and so they can say that the frequency of a particular DNA profile is 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million, or 1 in a billion. There are no population studies for any of these class characteristics that the FBI is looking at. So when the person says that the probability is 1 in 10,000, that's simply a made-up number. There is no data to support it, none. It's just made up.
Cases such as these inspired Peter Neufeld to start the Innocence Project in 1992 to investigate claims of wrongful convictions. Together with Donald Gates, they tirelessly campaigned for evidence to be retested using modern DNA techniques. Eventually, his wish was granted.
We worked and cooperated with the prosecution and police. They, on their own, eventually got a DNA match to a man who had been working as a part-time custodian at the Watergate office building, who had, just a half hour before the victim went home, been engaged in a kind of harassing conversation. So clearly at that point we realized, and everybody realized, that Donald Gates was completely innocent. He had been wrongly convicted. And what we do at the Innocence Project is we try and find out what were the causes of the wrongful conviction. In the case of Donald Gates, the contributing factors primarily were the false testimony given by this informant, who it turns out had been recently charged with a serious felony, and the felony was dropped after he claimed that Donald Gates had made a statement to him. And the other key piece of critical evidence, of course, was the hair testimony that came from the FBI crime laboratory.
Donald Gates was finally released almost 28 years after he was falsely convicted of murder. But the problems didn't end there for the FBI, as we'll hear later. Hair analysis has generally been treated with much more suspicion in this country, and the UK has been hailed a leader in the field of forensics. But many experts are now worried that our previous high standing is in jeopardy.
In the UK, Sir Alec Jeffreys, back in the 1980s, developed for the first time the technique of DNA profiling. So UK forensic science has always been held in very high esteem, both through its scientific advancements, but also through its practice and how it delivered forensic science as a service into our courtrooms. In recent years, that opinion has begun to change, and mainly it's begun to change partially as a result of the closure of the Forensic Science Service by the government in 2012.
The Forensic Science Service was a government-owned company carrying out testing and research in England and Wales. Before its closure in 2012, it was losing significant amounts of money. Its demise resulted in the first completely private market for forensic services in the world. Opinions differ amongst the scientists we talked to about whether the private market has been a success, but there is one area they all told us was in crisis following the closure of the FSS: research. Tiernan Coyle is a fibre analyst who runs a firm called Contact Traces.
We have lost, through the closure of the Forensic Science Service, about £3 to £4 million worth of research funding that the FSS used to use as their research budget. And that money hasn't been given to the research councils to divvy out in terms of forensic science funding. Now, the research councils operate on the Haldane principle, so that means they don't earmark anything for any particular discipline. They treat every project application on its own merits. So we need money set aside specifically for forensic science, of which we can apply for.
As a researcher looking for funding from the normal channels within the UK or indeed elsewhere, a lot of the government funding for research goes on blue skies research, on research that's going to develop new technologies and that's going to produce new products ultimately through interaction with industry. What we need to address as a forensic science research community is the deficiencies that have been pointed out as a result of the NAS report in the types of evidence we already are using, so that we can underpin them with good, strong, solid scientific basis.
Pretty much all scientists complain about not having enough funding available to them. Why do you think forensic science is facing a deeper crisis than other areas of science?
Well, I think, and I accept what you say, we all like a little bit more money to fund our work, absolutely. Why is it more important in forensic science? Well, forensic science is really one of the ultimate areas of how we use our science for the betterment of society. Forensic means in the service of the law. And what we are doing is we're applying our scientific knowledge and rigour and abilities to solve very, very specific problems that have the absolute highest stakes, because they're looking at aiding a jury to come to a conclusion about somebody's guilt or innocence, and that means somebody's liberty. And the stakes couldn't be higher.
The simple question that we ask here is, what price justice? It's my judgment, the judgment of my committee, having heard a huge amount of expert evidence, that if we carry on as we are, somebody will soon end up on the wrong side of the bars, either wrongly acquitted or wrongly convicted.
Andrew Miller is a former Labour MP and the outgoing chairman of the Science and Technology Select Committee. He oversaw a series of damning reports into the state of forensic science. As well as the lack of research funding, they voiced concerns over changes in the way forensic testing is commissioned, and they called on the government to devise a new strategy.
Some time ago, the government announced that there would be a forensic strategy published. I think it was about 18 months ago it was scheduled. It's just simply never arrived, and that's left a vacuum. There are real problems because that strategy should include issues around the control of laboratories, the regulation of laboratories, the lack of coordination through the research councils about primary research, the fragmentation of analytical work in individual cases. All of these lead one to have serious concerns about the future of the service.
We asked the Home Office to take part in this programme to respond to growing concerns over the lack of funding and strategy for forensic science. They sent us the following statement.
The Forensic Science Service was making operating losses of approximately £2 million per month when the decision was taken to close it down in December 2010. Since then, responsibility for commissioning forensic science services has been transferred to individual police forces and police and crime commissioners. Between 2013 and 2014, the National DNA Database produced nearly 25,000 matches between crime scenes and known individuals, including matches in 183 homicides and 482 rapes.
But according to leading forensic scientists like Angela Gallop, who founded the UK's first private laboratory in 1997, the focus on DNA has come at the expense of other forensic techniques.
It's always been a little bit of a Cinderella area. It had one moment in time in the early 2000s in a particular part of forensic science, which is in DNA profiling, when the government wanted to build up the national DNA database, and so they provided some match funding for forces to build up the number of reference samples in the database, which was tremendous. But the thing about science is that it's constantly moving on, and so in order to explore the possibilities for forensic science, and then once you've decided that something might be useful, to make sure that it's really meaningful and it's safe and you've got enough data to be able to be confident about the results, that requires a lot of research and development. It all goes back to this having a proper strategy for forensic science, and then you can decide how much in the way of funding you're going to devote to research and development, and importantly, in which areas you're going to devote it.
As we've seen, using unvalidated techniques can lead to serious miscarriages of justice. Over in the US, the false testimony presented at Donald Gates's trial was just the beginning of the FBI's problems. An investigation is currently probing the full extent of past errors.
Fortunately, today's FBI recognizes that that testimony was invalid scientifically, that it was erroneous. And so as a result of Mr. Gates's case, and then in rapid succession, 4 other FBI cases where hair had been introduced against them at the original trial, but many years later they were exonerated through DNA, the FBI agreed to do a review. So far, the review has uncovered approximately 2,000 cases where the FBI offered inculpatory hair evidence and where a conviction ensued. In fact, in more than a dozen of those cases, the individuals have already been executed. In a few dozen other cases, the individuals are currently on death row awaiting execution. And then in many hundreds of other cases, people are serving 30, 40, 50-year prison sentences. In some instances, the people are on parole.
Initial results released last week have been damning. Nearly every FBI examiner in the unit gave misleading testimony that favoured prosecutors, accounting for more than 95% of cases reviewed so far. It remains to be seen whether this flawed evidence resulted in other wrongful convictions, or worse, executions. In the US, the vast majority of forensic testing happens inside police-run laboratories. Now in the UK, there are concerns that more and more testing is being done in-house by the police. In its review of forensic services in the US, the National Academy of Sciences was highly critical of the quality of police testing.
The NAS committee were very worried about the fact that there were problems with the reliability and the validity and the accuracy of what was being done in many of these laboratories.
All too frequently, people who work in a crime laboratory that is affiliated with a law enforcement agency develop the sort of police officer's ethos and feel like we're part of a team, the purpose of which is to catch the bad guy. And science doesn't have that function. The purpose of science is to get to the truth.
Next week, we'll be looking at the crisis in the laboratory, asking if vital evidence is being missed, and whether specialist techniques used to catch killers, paedophiles and rapists are in danger of dying out.
Forensics in Crisis was presented by Linda Geddes. The producer was Michelle Martin.